James, you're doing both at once?
%, focused on the daf.
I don't hear you so much.
I'm 100% focused on the daf.
Oh, no, it's me, I think. Try again.
100% focused on the daf.
Oh, there you go. No, we'll take 50% of you. Okay.
What's up?
It sounds like
Let
I
me know what daf we're on.
late daf start tonight, so I apologize for that. I had trouble keeping up with the times. So I think we'll send this by email and we'll repeat it, but it sounds like the consensus is 45 minutes after Shabbat ends. So I guess that means that either they'll write a time in the bulletin or you'll have to keep track of 45 minutes from Shabbat. Whatever, use the end time in the bulletin. Go from there.
Are they going to round up or down? Are they rounding up or down?
Are we rounding up or down?
Why can't you start at an odd time? Okay. But
It's a machloket between Rav and Shmuel if we round up or down.
and I'll say this again. Thank you, Rabbi David Schwartz, as well, who's going to be doing daf tomorrow morning because I have to take my child to get COVID tested at 8 a.m. Unfortunately. And next, let's say Shabbat, God willing, we'll be able to lead the daf, but I'm going to be in Connecticut. So if the internet connection is poor, I might just call in. So you might not see me, but I'm hopeful that it will work out. I mean, I know it'll work out. I'm hopeful it will be a good video connection as well. So today's daf is daf Pei Gimel, I think, Hag. And David said he got to the 2 dots exactly at the beginning of the daf. Let me just quickly, there's a lot of numbers in today's daf, as there probably were yesterday. So if I make mistakes, which I'm sure will happen, please correct me. But the Mishnah that we're discussing was talking about kamahu shiuro. How much, what's the size that you need for your Eruv, we're talking here about Eruv. Well, we're actually going back and forth in a lot of things, but let's just say we're talking here about Eruv Tchumim, where you're talking about an Eruv that you're placing where you need, as we said, mazon shtei seudot. It's not so simple, and we've talked before, Rashi and Tosfot have different opinions about what you need for every Eruv. But you need 2 meals, and so we said in the Mishnah 2 different shiurim. One was the shiur of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, who, to make it very simple, but if you want me to make it complicated, I can do that too, who said that you need essentially he said you need a quart, he said you need half of a kav, basically, half of a kav, right? But we said in the Gemara yesterday that he really meant you need a quarter of a kav, that really you need a half of a kav, but you're giving half of it to the baker. And so for your meal that you're making, half of the quarter of the kav, half of the kav goes to the baker, and half goes to you. So for your meals, your kikar, you need a quarter of a kav. And we said yesterday, I think we said yesterday, but Rashi definitely says it, that a kav, Rashi says this all, is 24 beitzin, 24 eggs. And so a quarter of a kav would be 6 eggs, okay? That's Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka in the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon, which was the second opinion in the Mishnah, said that basically you need a third of a kav. So thankfully it also goes into 24, and that's a third of 24 is 8 eggs, okay? So you need 8 eggs.
Doesn't he say 2/9?
You need 2/9, but well.
Quarter of 32 is 8.
So it's a good question, but I'm going to skip over. We're going to count for 1/3 of the, well, he said you need 2/9 for the meals, but the language that he had in the Mishnah, if you have it, right, was that you need a kikar shalosh lekav, right? Where am I? Shtei yadot of a kikar, but the kikar is made shalosh lekav, basically, right? So So we're gonna go
Right, it
with
says you need 2/3 of it.
you need 2/3 of a kikar that's made 3 kikarot to a kav, right? So 3 kikars in a kav, meaning you need 2/9, basically, is what he came out with. Right. This is what you said. I know. So then the Mishnah said, I'm going to round it. I'm going to make it simpler. Again, 8 eggs. The Mishnah then said, so again, that's a kikar. The Mishnah then said that half of that is needed for a Beit HaMenugav. If you recall, which we probably talked about yesterday, there's a specific halacha. If you walk into a house that's tzarat, you become tameh right away. But your clothing doesn't become tameh until you eat in the house, is what the pasuk says. We understand that means not that you literally eat in the house, but that you stay in the house long enough to eat a meal. What's a meal? So that meal, which is what we call kedei achilat pras, is pras literally means a piece, but it means half of a kikar. So whatever kikar you said in the Mishnah, whether the kikar was 8 eggs or 6 eggs, half of that will be 4 eggs or 3 eggs, okay? And then the Mishnah said, and half of that is needed for psulat hagvi'ah. If you recall, there's a halacha, psul tuma, generally food does not make a person tameh, but there is a halacha midrabanan that if you swallow food in your throat, it will make you tameh, certain tuma, and that is true. How much do you have to swallow? That's half of that amount, so half of a pras, or a quarter of a kikar, which again will either be 1.5 eggs, a quarter of 6, or 2 eggs, a quarter of 8. And then today's Gemara, on top now, Daf Pei Gimel, says Tana, we learned in a Braita, chatzia, a quarter of half of a half of a half, meaning an eighth, is l'tamei tumat ochlin. That's the amount of food, right? We say that food is tamei. How much food? What's the shear of tumat ochlin? So as we usually say, and Rashi says here that we like Rabbi Shimon's opinion here, right, throughout Shas, because generally we'll quote that the shear of tumat ochlin is a beitza, is 1 egg. And so if you go according to Rabbi Shimon, it works out well because a kikar is 8 eggs, and so an eighth of that is 1. According again to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, it would be 3/4 of an egg. And
So it's Rabbi Yochanan who Rabbi Yochanan had the 8. Right?
Rabbi Yochanan had 6. Rabbi Yochanan had that each kikar
All right.
was 6. So a quarter, basically, as opposed to a third. So Tosfos here says that when we, throughout Shas, always say tumat ochlin is a beitza, we're always going according to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yochanan would disagree in all those cases and say it's again 3/4 of a beitza. But anyways, this says the Braita, chatzia, the top line is tamei tumat ochlin. So ask the Gemara, well, why didn't our Mishnah say that? Right? Our Mishnah said, again, a part of it is for tumat ohel, right, for negaim, half of it for negaim, half of that half for tumat ochlin beta blia. Why didn't we say half of that half of the half for the eighth? Tani my time lotani tumat ochlin. Why didn't our Mishnah say what the Brisa said about tumat ochlin? Mishum lo shavu shiurayu lahadadi. The reason is that the shiurim are not exactly equivalent. Again, and how do we know that? The Tanya, as we learned in a Braita, and again, stop me if you want me to review it because it's confusing even to me, and maybe others. Kama shir chatzi pras. Right, so remember, a pras is a piece. A pras is, we always say, kedei achilat pras. The kikar that you have for your eruv is 2 meals, which is what the eruv is, right? A pras, which is half of that, is 1 meal. And again, let's just assume we're going, Rashi says we are, or the Gemara actually is going to say we're going according to Rabbi Shimon, who says that the kikar is 8 eggs. So the pras, which is half of that, is 4 eggs. Says the Braita, what is half of a pras? That's shnei beitzim, 2 eggs, chasar kima, minus a little bit. It's a little bit less than 2 eggs. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yossi says shnei beitzim shochakot, I think it's with the shin, right? That it's 2 eggs that are smiling, is usually that are broad, that are generous, meaning a little bit more than 2 eggs, right? And so basically what the Braita says is that it's not exactly 2 eggs. It's either a little bit more or a little bit less. And that's presumably because they disagreed about the size of eggs, meaning that eggs either got a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger. Says the Braita, Shi'er Rebbe once measured it out, and Rebbe concluded that Shnei Beitzim Ve'od, that the shear of chatzi pras is a little bit more than 2 eggs using our current eggs. I mean, even though originally it might have been 2 eggs, now it's 2 eggs plus a little bit more. Maybe our eggs got a little bit smaller. Ask the Gemara, kama ve'od, what does a little bit more mean? You got to define that. Says the Gemara, echad me'esrim bebeitza. It means 1/20th of an egg. So Rashi has 2 pshatim in this, but one he likes, which I think is very consistent, though we'll see a problem later, is that 1/20th of an egg is 5%, right? So each egg of ours is, you need 1.05 of our eggs to equal 1 egg that they talked about. So when it says 2 eggs, it means 2.1 eggs. This is how Rashi likes that shot, okay? So you need basically, if you're measuring out 2 eggs, you need 2 plus a little bit more. So
Are they
that's
talking about the volume of the egg?
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct. The volume of the egg. That's by chatzi pras, right? And ilub gabi tumat ochlen. But when you then talk about tumat ochlen, which I told you to show was a beitzah, Tanya, the Braita there says that it's exactly a beitzah. And Rabbi Natan, Rabbi Dosa amru ki beitzah shamru kimoha ukiklipata. There's a machloket. This, the Tanna Kama holds that it's the egg and its shell, right? Because obviously you have to ask, talking about volume, right? Is it just the volume of the liquid, or is it the shell?
Yeah.
Says Rabbi Natan, Rabbi Dosa, it's the shell. And Chachamim omrim, which is how we paskin, kimoha below kilipata. The inside of an egg, not the shell of an egg. But either way, the point is that it's exactly 1 egg, whereas in terms of chatzi pras, we understand that chatzi pras means either, again, it's machloket, either a little bit more than 2 eggs or a little bit less than 2 eggs. So because it's not exactly the same, our Mishnah did not include this last category, which is chatzia for tumat ochlim. Okay, but in fact, that it is a very similar measure.
How
How am I rough from Bar Papa?
How
Sorry.
could you measure it without the shell?
Well, first of all, it's liquid, right? So you can have the liquid's volume, but also I guess you can have a hard-boiled egg. But I think it's the liquid, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, I see.
I mean, you could boil and have hard-boiled, but I actually think you take the volume,
Okay, yeah,
Thank you.
but not if it's.
crack it open.
Well,
I mean, look, of course, every egg is not the same, right? Let's be honest, right?
right.
So I don't exactly know how you do that. To be honest.
Volume displacement.
No, I'm saying, but if you can get 5 eggs from a chicken, they're not exactly the same, right? So you have to use either medium-sized eggs or whatever. I mean, whatever, they have sizes nowadays, right? Jumbo eggs, that kind of thing. So,
Right.
I don't know. Yes, David.
What the Gemara began by saying that we were talking about 1 egg according to Rabbi Shimon and 3/4 of an egg according to Rabbi Yochanan, but then we started talking about 2 egg. How did we make that transition from 1 egg
No,
to 2?
so chatzi pras is, remember, a pras is either 4 eggs or 3 eggs. Chatzi pras is half of that. The shear of chatzi pras, our Mishnah said, is the shear for tumat beit habliya. The thing we were initially talking about is what's the shear for food that's tumat ochlim, right? If you have a amount of food, it only becomes tameh when it hits a certain amount of size, when it's considered notable, right? So that was the half of that. So maybe that was chatzi pras. Remember, the word pras is essentially the word chetzi. So chatzi. So we're saying that if you say that tumat ochlim is exactly half, right, of chatzi pras, that doesn't work out if your chatzi pras is not exactly 2. If your chatzi pras is 2.1, right?
Okay, thanks.
Now, it's very similar, which is why the Braita says it, but that's why our Mishnah didn't say it. But points out the Gemara, which I skipped over a little bit. Amar of Chisda, Amar Rav from Bar Papa, Amar of Chisda, Zu divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi. Now, this thing that we just quoted is the opinion that chatzi chatzia is 1, that 1/8 is 1 egg, 1/8 of the full kikar is 1 egg. That's according to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi. But the Chachamim hold that it's kibeitza or mechza shochakot. Sorry, I made a mistake. The second Braita, the Braita that talked about the shear of chatzi pras, saying it's 2 minus a little bit or 2 plus a little bit, that's going according to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. But according to the Chachamim, a chatzi pras is 1.5 generous, because they hold, that's Gemara, man Chachamim, Rabbi Yochanan Mebroka. Right, that's Rabbi Yochanan Mebroka, holds that basically a kikar is 1/4 of a kav, which is 6 eggs. A pras, which is half a kikar, is 3 eggs, and chatzi pras is 1.5 eggs. This is more pshita. I can do math also, right? So yeah, I understand that's a real Yochanan broke it. No, the chiddush is shochakot atalashmim. The chiddush is that when we say 1.5, it's not 1.5 mitzumtzam, which means exact. It means 1.5 generous. And again, usually we mean by that you add a little bit. You either a bigger egg. It's not so clear exactly what it means, or you like sort of extend them. You round up a little bit, but it means you view it generously, not exactly. But it's still the part that it's Rabbi Yochanan broke was not a chiddush. Ki Adar Rav Dimi. Now, when Rav Dimi came from, I guess, Eretz Yisrael, or maybe to Eretz Yisrael, he said, Amar, no, I guess from Eretz Yisrael, it's usually Ki Adar. He came back. Amar, he said, Shigar Bunyas the Rebbe. Bunyas, who I guess was a very famous, measurement person, or maybe a prominent person of some sort, sent Rebbe Mudia de Kundis. The measurement from Kundis, Rashi says this was a measurement that was known to be a sa'ah, right? Remember that sa'ah was sort of the uber measurement, right? That we talked about, I think, yesterday a little bit, and Rashi talked about it for sure. Remember that a sa'ah is 6 kav, okay? So I told you a kav equals 24 eggs, right? A sa'ah is 6 kavim. And it came from min ne'usa, it came from this place Rashi said min ne'usa. The Shi'er Rebbe, and Rebbe measured that instead of, now, what did I tell you? That a kav is 24 eggs and there's 6 kav in a sa. So someone who has a, good calculator can do the math. 24 times 6 is 144, James is telling us. And Rebbe measured matan v'shava esrei be'im, 217 eggs, which is not 144. So everyone was very, very puzzled, okay? Says the Gemara, what happened? Ha-sa dehecha. What kind of sa was this? Now, of course, if you recall, since you've all learned a lot of daf, the Gemara often talks about the fact that they changed the measurements, right? And of course, when we get to ribbit in Bava Metzia, it's going to make everything very complicated. But there was we're going to have the bright about it later today, but I'll speak it out before we read it inside. The initial measurements are called the Sa'ah Midbarit, of the desert, meaning Moshe Rabbeinu, back in the day. At some point, they added to that sa'ah, meaning they made it, instead of including 144 eggs, they added what we say is a shtut, right? A sixth. But of course, when the Gemara says a sixth, they mean a fifth, right? So to clarify, right? Shtut is mila bar, from the outside, meaning that you take 1/5 of the total, you add it to that, and then what you added is 1/6 of the new total. Right? Let's say you have 5 portions, you add a 6th one, you have 6. So the added one was a 6th of the new total. But the way to do that is to add a 5th. So then this is called a Sa'ah Yerushalmi. So a Sa'ah Yerushalmi is a 5th bigger than a Sa'ah Midbarit. And I'll tell you, I did the math already. You can trust me or not. That if you add a 5th, you will get 173 eggs. I got 172.8, but we round up. So the Sa'ah Yerushalmit is 173 eggs. Now, at another time, they added another 6th, and now it's called the Sa'ah Tziporit. In Tzipori, they added a 6th, which again is a 5th. If you add a 5th to 173, did the math, and I got 207.5, which our Gemara calls 207. Maybe I got 207.4. Either way, it rounds it down to 207. So none of those are 217, just for the record, but they're getting closer, right? So says the Gemara, now I'm gonna read that inside. What's ha-sa'ah dehecha? Meaning which sa'ah are you using? If it's the sa'ah of the desert, that's 144. Kuf mem daled havi, as James so elegantly told us, right? 24 times 6. Yerushalmit, I told you kufay and gimel havi, which again, I think it's a little bit less, but we round up. That's 180, 173. Tziporit, which again is another 5th added on, Reish Zayin havi, that's 207. So none of those are 217. Says more, well, what Rebbe must have figured out, what that measurement that Rebbe got must have been the Tziporit, IT, right? And I'm sorry, the Tziporit. It was a Sa'ah Tzipori, which is 207 eggs. How come Rebbe measured 217? Because what they did in that Sa'ah was IT Chalta Shadi Alayu. They took the amount that you would have to separate for Challah. So they figured, we want you to be left with a full Sa'ah. So we're going to start off with more than a full sa'ah, so that after you take out your challah, you've got a sa'ah left. So presumably 10 extra will go to challah. I asked the Gemara, 1 second, how much is challah? Now, if you learned daf 2 days ago, we talked about this, right? Chalta kamehavin tamni. If you recall, we said 2 days ago, I think, it's definitely the end of last week, that challah, at least in a private house, is 1/24th, right? So if you take 1/24th, and again, we're also doing a lot of rounding here, but if you take 1/24th, right, so that's around 4 in 100. So out of 207, you're going to take around 8 eggs for challah, right? Around 8. It's really 8 1/4, 8 1/3, I'm sorry, right? But Rashi's, we ignore the last bit because it's not a full egg. So you're at 8 for challah. So 207 plus 8 is 215. You're still batzerle, you're still short from 217. We're assuming, despite all the rounding, that you have to have very, very exact measurements. So if you only have 8 eggs for challah, it's not perfect. Ella says, Gemara, you're right. What you have to do is Aiti the odot de Rebbe. Take the extra that Rebbe talked about. Remember, Rebbe said earlier today that whenever they talked about an egg, it means 1.05 of our eggs. Now, if you take 1.05 of our eggs, so no, Rashi likes the pshat that forget about the challah, right? So you have 207. Remember, I told you that the sa'ah of tzipori was 207. If you have to add 1 egg for each 20 eggs, right? Because each egg is really 1.05. So then you add 5 eggs for the first 100 and 5 eggs for the second 100, and you get 217. Beautiful. So that's exactly what happened. They took the odot of Rebbe and Shadi Alayim, and they added it on top of it. Well, that's great. You have 217. But what about the other 7 eggs, right? You got to take 5% of 7 eggs, which is 0.35 eggs, a third of an egg. Ihachi, havi leitfei. You're going to have a little bit too much. You'll have 217 and a third. Says, well, yeah, but it's a tiny bit. Since it was less than 1, we don't count it. And so that's why this measurement that Rebbe found had 217 eggs, because really the shear of a sa'ah is 207 eggs. But because our eggs are a tiny bit smaller, and you have to give 1.05 eggs for each historical egg, you have to add 20%, not 20%, 5%. And when you add 5% to 200, you get 210 plus the 7, 217. And so that explains Rebbe's, the measurement that Rebbe found.
I think
Now,
our eggs are getting bigger.
Yeah, I'm going to avoid that. I don't know.
I'm just saying.
Fair enough, but exactly. Maybe where Rebbe lived, though, they had very unhealthy chickens. I don't know, they were smaller.
Okay.
But Tanur Rabbanan, let's read the Braita which speaks out everything I just said. Sa'ah Yerushalmit, the Sa'ah of the Yerushalmi, meaning the new Sa'ah, was Yitera Midbarit Shtut. It was a 6th, which again always means a 5th, bigger, not always, but in most contexts means a 5th, bigger than the Sa'ah Midbarit. So the Sa'ah Midbarit was 144 eggs. The Sa'ah Yerushalmit was 173. And Shel Tziporit was Yitera Yerushalmit Shtut. It was another 6th on top, which again means another 5th, on top of the Sa'ah Yerushalmit. So again, just to do the numbers, 144, 173, and 207 eggs. Nimtzeit, turns out that Shel Tziporit Yitera Midbarit Shlish, that the newest one, right, that you added a 6th and a 6th, the newest one is a third bigger than the old one. Of course, that's ridiculous, right? Because if you add a third, you didn't add a third of the first one twice. You added a third of the first one and then a third of the second one. So it's not a 6th. Sorry. You added a 6th of the first one and a 6th of the second one. That doesn't equal the third because they were different 6ths, right? I could do the math together. But you started with 144. You added, sorry, I wrote down how much you added. You added 29 to get to 173. And then you added 34 to get to 207 because a fifth of a bigger number is going to be bigger than the small one. So how could together that equal a third? You can't add them together. It says shlish deman, a third of what, right? So now it's going to go through the numbers. But just again, to point it out, if you added from 144 to 207, you ended up adding 63 eggs in total, okay? 144 to 207 is 63. So shlish deman, a third of what? Ilema shlish de midbarit. If you're saying you added a third from the sa'ah of the midbar, remember the sa'ah of the midbar is 144 eggs. Michti, shlish de midbarit kama havin arba tamne, right? 48. A third of 144 is 48. But I just told you, ilo defet shitin mutat. You added 63 eggs, so that's not even close, right? 48 and 63 are very different. Ella, maybe we're saying it's a third of the Sa'ah Yerushalmit. Remember, the Sa'ah Yerushalmit is 173. What's a third of 173?
Okay.
57 and 2/3. I'm going to give it away. Okay. So then, ila shlishti Yerushalmit, shlishti da kamahavi. What's a third of 173? Chamishinu tamnaya nachitilta. 58 minus a third. Which is where the Gemara says 57 and 2/3, right? So it's and ila odefet shitinu tlat. We're still consistent. The odef is 63. So you're still off by 5 or so. Ella shlishti tzipori. It must be a third tzipori. What's shlishti da kamahavin? Remember, I told you it was 207. A third of 207 is 69, right? It's shivin nachichada, 70 minus 1. Well, that's much more than that. Ilo odfa samach gimel is only 63. So none of it doesn't add up. What are you talking about? Ella Amr Birmia, this is what the Bright is trying to teach you. Hachikamar. Nimseit sa'a shal tzipori yitera al midbarit. If you look at the extra, the sa of tzipori, which was a sixth plus a sixth, or a fifth plus a fifth, is 63 more than the midbarit. Karov lishlish shela. That's close to a third of itself, because I told you a third of itself is 69. So 63 is close to 69. And furthermore, shlish shela, which is 69, right? A third of 207 is karov, the mechza de midbarit, is almost half of the midbar. The midbar was 144, so half of that is 72. So 69 is close to 72. That's ridiculous. Eruvin. What's all this karov business, right? I know 63 is not close to 60. Midi karov kanani. It doesn't say in the Braita that it's close. It says it is. It's the same. El Amar Eruvin. This is what it means to say. Hachikamer. Nimtsaet shlish shel tzipori. If you take a third of tzipori, right? Again, a third of tzipori is 69, right? If you take that and you add the odiot shel Rebbe, you add the odiot of Rebbe. Remember, Rebbe requires that for each 20 eggs, you add 1 egg, right? And so since you're adding 1 egg, 69 plus 3 equals 72, right? Plus, I'm going to skip the little plus, right? But 72. And that is Yetera al mechza shel midbarit shlish beitza. That's almost exactly the same as half of the midbarit, but a third more, right? Because the midbarit was 144, so half of that was 72. And this, a third is 69, but if you take an extra egg for each 20, right, you get 3 extra, so 72. And if you take a third of an egg for the extra 9, which really is close to half, right? 10 would be half, but a third is close. And this is where Tosfos says Rashi starts falling apart. Because like, why would 1/20th be considered a third? But either way, it's much easier. Then it's around 72. And so a third, just to clarify, a third of the sa'ah of tzipori is almost identical to half of the sa'ah of the midbar.
What are we talking about? What is the importance of this?
Well, so the importance is critical. Every time we give a measurement.
This is the shiur for an Eruv, or what?
This is the shiur for an Eruv, correct? A portion of this.
Portion of this.
Right. So the most important implication of this is for business, of course, right? Mekach u'memkar. If you tell someone, I want to buy a sa'ah, or I'm purchasing this.
Oh, we're trying to establish how big these measurements are.
Exactly. We're trying to establish standards.
Standards, I see.
And so the standard
for anything.
Yeah, for commerce, let's say, is the easiest
Right.
explanation, right?
Okay.
And as I said, it really comes up a lot with interest when you start talking about that. But yes,
Yeah.
so the challenge is, of course, that the terminology is fixed, that a sa'ah equals, this many kav, which equals this many lug, but the sa'ah changes.
These are volume measurements or not weight measurements, right?
These are,
I mean, these are measurements
well,
of,
they convert one to the other.
these
So
are,
they're volume measurements. Well, I'm going to go with volume here. They're also weight measurements, but here we're talking about volume measurements, right? We're going to, at least on the bet, we're going to talk about volume measurements.
okay.
Okay, but we convert one to the other.
Okay.
But here, because we're going to talk about lugin, which of course is volume.
Okay.
Okay, 2 dots, right? Tanu Rabbana. Now, getting back to our question of challah, it says you should take the first part of your dough, of your arisa, right? Says the Gemara, the Braita, that means kedei arisotechem. It means you have to have the size of a dough in order for it to be chayiv and challah. Kama arisotechem. What is the isotechem? Sorry, take it. It says in the pasuk Isotecha. The Braita says it means isotecha, your dough. What is your dough? What's the size of a piece of dough? Kama isotechem. Well, you learn from the man, right? From Isata Midbar. It says that they got man in the shear of an ephah, right? An ephah. Now, Rashi quotes over here from the Gemara in Menachot that an ephah is same as a bat, and together basically it's 3 sa'in. So an ephah is 3 sa'in, right? So kama isata midbar. What is considered isata midbar? Dichtiv the ha'omer, which was what they were given, right, is asirit ha'efahi. An omer, which is a share of food, of a meal, is 1/10 of an ephah. So again, an ephah, I'll just do, and Rashi speaks this all out. An ephah is 3 sa'in. A sa'ah is 24 kav, right? So that's whatever number. And a kav is 4 lugin, okay? So a 3 sa'in equals 72 lugin, right? 3 sa'in equals 18 kav, which equals 72 lugin.
Just say that again. An ephah is 3
An
sa'ah.
ephah is 3 sa'ah.
Yeah.
A sa'ah is 6 kavim. So an ephah is 18 kavim, 3 times 6. A kav is 4 lugin. And a lug is, well, 4 kav, right? So 72. So there are 72 lugin in the shear in an ephah, okay? And asirita ephah is 1/10 of that. So our asirita ephah is 7 lug plus 2/10, right? Plus 2, plus 1/5 of a lug. 2/10, yeah. Okay, 7 lugin plus 1/5 of a lug is a asirit ha'ephah, because an ephah is 72 lugin. Says the Braita, Mikan Amru, from here they said, Shiva riva'in kemach, you need 7 quarters. Now, quarter is another term for lug, because I told you a lug is a quarter of a kav, right? So 7 lugin of kemach, Ve'od, and a little bit more, which is another 1/5, would be chayevet b'chala. So the amount of shear that you need for chala is basically 7.2 lugin, which is an asirita ephah. 7.2 lugin. Now says the Braita, and you guys are, which is going to be very easy because we just learned it, that is in size of midbarit. But when you come to size of Yerushalmit, which is, remember, a 5th bigger, right, or 6th milagav, you have to divide by 6, right? And 7.2 divided by 6 is 1.2, right? So you subtract 1.2, and the amount of lugin that you need for challah, if you're measuring in Yerushalmi measurements, which are bigger, is only 6, right? Shehein shisha shel Yerushalmit. That's 6 Yerushalmit. And 6 divided by 6 is 1, right? So if you're going to tzipori measurements, which are 1/6 bigger, then you go from 6 to 5, right? Shehein chamisha shel tzipori. So it turns out to be very easy math because it all divides by 6, right? So 7.2 lugin if you're measuring in the midbar shiurim, which are smaller. 6 lugin if you're measuring in the Yerushalmi lugin, which are a little bit bigger, and 5 lugin if you're measuring in the tzipori lugin. Not that I know what any of these things are, but but I mean they're all equivalent, right? But there are different measurements that got a little bit bigger, and that is harezu. I'm sorry, and mikan amru. This is the end of the Braita. Ha'ochel k'midazu. If you eat this amount for a meal, which is a big amount, hareze bari. That's a healthy umivurach. That's a nice meal. Yeter al kain. If you eat more than this, rav atan. We continue to be a glutton. You're eating more than you should. Pachot mikan. If you eat less than this, mikukaba meyav. I think your intestines are messed up, or maybe you have stomach ache, and that's why you're not eating enough. But the proper good amount to eat is around 6, 5, 7.2 kav, depending on how you do the measurements, which I think equals somewhere in like 10 egg or 12 egg range or something like that. Anyway, so that's a good healthy meal. Okay, now Charlie used to have a graph that he would show us which showed what all these things were, but we don't have that graph, but you could probably look it up. Continues the Mishnah. Back off the topic of measurements. Let's say you have people who live in a common courtyard but they're separate. Rashi understands, the Gemara is going to define this more as we get on, that each group made an Eruv for themselves. So people live on the ground floor, that's Anshe Chatzer. People live on the Merpeset, which is the second floor. Each group made their own Eruv between them, but they didn't make one between group A and group B. And the question is, if you have things that are between them, if you recall, last parak, we talked a lot about you have a wall between two chatzerot, right? What's the status of the wall? That's very similar, because there each chatzer has its own Eruv, but the wall is sort of shared between them. So says the Mishnah, if you have Anshe Chatzer v'Anshe Merpeset, sheshachachu v'lo irvu, they didn't make an Eruv, again, between the two groups, but each group made an Eruv among themselves, then kol shegavo asara tfachim, if anything that's in this chatzer that's on a shelf that's more than 10 tfachim tall, that goes to the Merpeset. That's considered to be the space of the Merpeset because it's high up and the people below are presumably can't reach it. It's hard for them to reach it. Not they can't, but it's hard. And therefore you assume that's space, that's common space for the second story. And so the people on the second story can put something on that or take something off that, but the people on the first story cannot. Pachot mikan, if it's lower than that, meaning it's on like a ledge that's less than 10 tfachim, then it goes to the chatzer, which we think means that it's then used by the chatzer, not by the second story. Let's say you have chuyat bar, you have the dirt around the bar, right? They would dig out a well, and the dirt that you dug out, you would put as walls basically on the side of the well. So, like a well wall. Or sela, or you have a big rock in the middle of the chatzer that are gavoin asarat tfachim, they're more than 10 tfachim tall, then they go to the Merpeset. Now it seems pretty repetitive, and we'll talk about it, right? But that goes to the Merpeset. If it's pachot mikan, if it's lower than 10 tfachim, then it goes to the chatzer. Adds the Mishnah a very important detail, which probably goes to both parts. That you say it goes, if it's above 10 tfachim, that it goes to the Merpeset group, that's bismucha. If it's right next to the Merpeset, meaning you could reach out from your front door and touch it and get it. Aval b'mifleget, let's say it's 10 feet away from you in the middle of the chatzer, the fact that it's 10 tfachim off the ground doesn't matter, you still can't get it, right? Then afilu gavar asar tfachim, it goes to the chatzer. Okay. The ezahu smucha, what does close by mean? She'eino rechoka arba tfachim. It means it's less than 4 tfachim. It's got to be really close to you, like 1.5 feet, right? Or else it's sort of out of your zone. So it means it's really close to you. Okay. Is this clear in the Mishnah? Hope so.
Which group in the Merpeset case, did any group have in mind to include that?
No, it's dumb. No one specified it. It wouldn't necessarily matter if you specified it, right? So again, you just make an Eruv, right? You don't say you say you're joining together the people who are part of the Eruv.
Right.
But imagine a situation when you have 4 houses on the ground floor. There's a stairway up, which is what a Merpeset is, right? And you have 4 houses opening up to the Merpeset. So the 4 on the bottom did an Eruv, and the 4 on the top, but both of them have to go into the chatzer in order to get into Reshut Rabim. I don't have pictures in front of me, but probably some has pictures. So we're going to discuss this in more detail, but the upper ones can join with each other on their Merpeset. They're considered to be one area. The lower ones join together, but the space that's in the chatzer, presumably anything below 10 tfachim, we're assuming, goes to the bottom people. Anything above is common space for the top people, if it's close.
So we're talking about how much space is included in your Eruv.
We're talking about if there's something on that peg. Let's say there's a sandwich on this ledge, on this 10 tfachim tall amud, let's say, a pillar. Can you reach onto that pillar and take it and bring it into your house? Or can you throw something from your house and leave it landed on the pillar? I mean, the pillar could be a huge, broad area, right? Can you throw something from your house and let it land on that pillar? Is that pillar considered to be your reshut or not?
And I imagine that, they would every Shabbat, if that pillar is there, one of the groups knows that that's part of their reshut or something like that, right?
Presumably, that's what we're clarifying. So the Gemara is going to go through all the cases. Pshita. It says the Gemara, it's obvious, and we're going to see why this is said here. But it's obvious that lezeh bepetach. Let's say you have a space between 2 chatzerot, and in order to get there, one group has a doorway access, which is very easy access. The other group also does. That's just, for example, let's say, we talked about this before. Let's say you have a window, right, between 2 chatzerot. And of course, in order for it to count as its own space, it has to be 4 by 4 tefachim. But it's a totally usable space between 2 courtyards. each courtyard can go into it very easily. Petach means you have a door, which just means very easy direct access. So then, Hainu Chalon Shebein Shein, oh, it's the Gemara's case. Hainu Chalon Shebein Shtei Chatzerot, which we said earlier is prohibited, right? If both groups made an Eruv, you can eat in the Chalon, you can go there, but you can't carry from the Chalon into your Chatzer, unless you make an Eruv, right? If, let's say, Lezeb is Rika, let's say there's a space that both groups can use, 2 Chatzerot, but it's not easy for them to get it, they'd have to throw to get on top of it. Meaning they'd have to jump up or grab something high. It's very high. It's hard to get to. Then that's also Hainu Kotel Shebein Shtei Chatzerot, which, if you recall, we talked about earlier. When you have a wall between 2 Chatzerot, anything on top of that wall is prohibited to be brought into either Chatzer. And these are all cases we had earlier. And Rashi quotes them all here if you need a reminder. Lezeb b'shilshul, lezeb b'shilshul. What about if it's below ground? And the only way to get to it is to lean down and drag it up, right? Shilshul means to pull it up, which was the case we had in last parak of the charitz, right? Remember, you had the ditch between 2 chatzerot. So then, hainu charitz shebein shtei chatzerot. That's the same case we had earlier, which we said earlier, that if the charitz is 4 by 4 tvachim, and we had a whole discussion about how big it has to be, then it asers both, then things in it are aser to both courtyards. And continues this Gemara statement, lezeb petach, lezeb rika. Let's say one group, in order to get to this area, has a doorway, meaning they can just walk right into it. And one group has to jump up to get it, meaning, as we said earlier, the courtyards are not equal, right? So it's flat, it's eye level for me, but it's, super high for you. So then, because it's easier for me to get to it than the other group, because my eye the petach, then it goes to the people who are easier to get to it. Hainu de Rabba bar Rav Huna Rav Nachman, which Rabba Rav Huna Rav Nachman said earlier, that in that case, because there's Tashmisho ben Noach, remember, it's easier for me to get to it, and there's Tashmisho ben Kasheh, that it goes to the one who's easier to get to it. If it's Lezeb Izrika, did I skip some lines? Yeah, Lezeb Petach, Lezeb Shilshol, which is also, for one person, it's easy to get to, one person, they have to lean down, right? Their courtyard's much higher. So to get to the space, they have to reach down. Then again, you go to the one who can get to it easily. Hainu de Rav Shizbi, Rav Nachman. That's what Rav Shizbi Rav Nachman, which I had just a couple of daf ago, was quoted as saying that, again, the same halacha. The one who's Tashmisho ben Noach, it's easier to get to, it's considered part of their reshut. What about if it's hard for both of us to get to it? What if it's lezeb shilshul, lezeb zrika? One group has to lean down to get there, and one group has to reach up and jump or throw something there to get there. So, right, it's in between 2 chatzerot. One is lower than it, and one is much higher than it. So, what's the halacha there, right? So says Rav, the halacha is that they're equivalent. And whenever you're equivalent, you aser on each other, meaning it goes to both groups. When a space is shared by 2 groups that didn't make an Eruv, they're both prohibited to go into that space. Amarav shnehem asurim, they're both aser. Shmuel says, no, I disagree. Notnin oto lezeh shebeshilshul. You go to the ones who can reach down to get to it, because it's always easier to reach down and get something than to jump up and get something, even though it's hard for both. Right? So neither one is an ideal, but it's relatively easier for one, and therefore you give it shalazeh tashmisho ben nachat. The one who reached down, it's a little bit easier to get to. Lezeh tashmisho bekasheh. Bechol davar shetashmisho lezeh ben nachat lezeh bekasheh. Whenever, and this is a principle we said, whenever something is easy for one group and hard for another group, notino to lezeh shetashmisho ben nachat. So that was what Shmuel said. So again, everyone agrees that if it's easy for one group and hard for another, it goes to the easy group, the easy chatzer. The question here was, it's hard for both groups, but it's relatively harder for one. And so that Rob said it doesn't matter. It's hard for both groups, and therefore it's not easy for both groups. So it's equivalent, and therefore it asers. And Shmuel said, I disagree, that if it's relatively easier for one group, you give it to that group. Now, why do we quote this whole thing? It's none, because our Mishnah seems to indicate one way or the other. What did our Mishnah say? Anshe chatzer v'anshe mirpeset, right? You have people who live on the lower level. You have people who live on the higher level. Now, we're assuming that this thing, sheshachachu, they forgot, this is a quote from our Mishnah, below Eruvin, said the Mishnah, kol shegavoa asarat tvachim l'mirpeset. If it's on a pillar that's more than 10 tvachim, it goes to the mirpeset. If it's pachot mikan, if it's lower than that, it goes to the chatzer. Now, kasaka daitach, we think now, in reading the Mishnah, that my mirpeset, what does mirpeset mean? It means they're b'nei aliyah. meaning they live on a second story, which is 10 feet off the ground. The mirpeset is below them, but above the ground level people. And essentially, this is the case where it's not convenient for anybody, but it's more convenient for the higher people than lower people, because it's always easier to reach down than to jump up. And my Karli Merpeset, why do we call it a Merpeset? Because the Kasalki bin Merpeset, they don't live on the ladder, right? They live on a second story, but they have to climb up a Merpeset, which is the ladder, to get to their second story. And so this seems to be exactly Shmuel and Rav and Shmuel's case. Alma, you see, that Kol Lezeb Shilshul, the people on the second story, they got to reach down to get this thing from the ladder, from the Merpeset. And Lezeb Izrika, the people on the first story, on the ground floor, have to jump up or throw up something to put it up there. And so you see in our Mishnah that if it's above 10 tfachim, even though it's inconvenient for both, you give it to the ones who are on top, who have to reach down. So it seems to be an exact Mishnah going against Rav, right? And going like Shmuel. Says where it's not a question. Because the Amr of Huna, it doesn't mean that the people live on a second story and they're reaching down to the ladder. It means they live on the ladder level, meaning they live right above, they live on that level. So that they live, Rashi explains, it means they live right, 3 feet off the ground. So you have a very small area above. And so when this thing is 10 tefachim off the ground, it's right on their level. It's not that they have to reach down to get to it. They're living on, not on a second story. They're living on a, you have the split level things. They live like on a split level. They live a little bit higher than the ground level. And therefore they, when it's 10 tefachim off the ground, it's directly reachable for them. It says the Gemara, Hachanami, here too, Lotan Adarim B'Merpeset. Ask the Gemara, Yihachi Ema Seifa. And again, look at the next case in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, if it's Pachot Mikan, right? Let's say this thing is on a pillar in your Chatzer, less than 10 tefachim tall. Let's say it's 9 tefachim off the ground. So then it goes to the Chatzer. It goes to the people who live in the Chatzer. Why? Amai. I just told you that the Merpeset is 15 tefachim off the ground. So if the Merpeset is 15 tefachim off the ground, I could reach down 6 tefachim and get this thing. You can reach up 9 tefachim and get it. Why isn't it accessible to me in the Merpeset and accessible to you in the Chatzer? It should be Lezeb Petachu, Lezeb Petachu. It should be accessible to both, right? Now, of course, if you're assuming that the people on the second story live 30 tefachim off the ground, then of course, if it's less than 10 tefachim, it's not accessible. But if you're assuming that they live just a little bit off, just 15 or 20 tefachim off, it's very close to them. Says the Gemara, when the Mishnah says lichatzer, it doesn't mean that you can use it for the people in the chatzer. It means af lichatzer, that if it's less than 10 tefachim off the ground, it's usable also for the people in the chatzer, meaning the people in the merpeset and the people in the chatzer. And of course, when 2 people can use something and they didn't make an eruv with each other, it becomes usher for everybody. And that's what the Mishnah means. It means af lichatzer b'shneim asurim. And in fact, hachanami mistavra, this is the only way you could have read the Mishnah. Because what's the second case in the Mishnah? Niktani seifa. It's only true if this pillar is very close to the mirpeset. Ava b'mufleget, if it's away from the mirpeset, then even if it's more than 10 tefachim, it goes to the chatzer. How could that be? Right? Let's say you have a pillar, it's 20 tefachim tall, it's far away from the mirpeset. It says the Mishnah, it goes to the chatzer. It can't go to the chatzer because it's 10 tefachim off the ground. They can't reach it. So it's tashmisho b'kasha, right? And so avon b'mufleget, I feel like lechatzer. My lechatzer, imem lechatzer v'shari. It goes to people in the chatzer, and they can carry off and onto this thing. Amai reshuta de tervayavu. It's hard for the people in the merpeset to get there. It's hard for the people in the chatzer to get there. So it's equivalent. It should be aser because it's both. Ella, when it says my lechatzer, that's exactly what it means. It means af lechatzer, that it also has equal rights to the chatzer. And so if it's below 10 tefachim, right, then the people in the chatzer can get to it easily. If the people in the merpeset can get to it easily, and since they can both get there easily, it's also to both. If it's above 10 tefachim, if it's close to the merpeset, and the merpeset people can get to it easily, and the chatzer people cannot get to it easily, and then it goes to the merpeset. But if it's far away from the merpeset, and it's above 10 tefachim, then both the people in the chatzer can get there with difficulty, because it's too high, and the people in the merpeset can get there with difficulty because it's too far away, and therefore they're equivalent. And when they're equivalent, it becomes usher to both. So when we say af the chatzer, it means shneim asurin. Hachanami, my lechatzer, af the chatzer, shneim asurin, shmamina. And that's supports what Rav says, in fact, that when you have tashmisho, that's kasher to both. Even if it's a different kind of kasher, it becomes usher to both of them. Okay, very clear?
4 cases, right? One is that there's two, right? If the lower level, can I just say lower level and upper level?
Absolutely.
The lower level can reach it. It's less than 10 tfachim. So then that belongs to them.
Only, no. Only if the top level can't reach it.
And they can't reach it, right?
Right.
Or if it's the other way, the top level can reach it, but the lower level can't.
And it goes
It's
to them.
10 tfachim, and it's reachable. So then it belongs to them. That means they can access it, right?
Correct.
Okay, then what's the case where they can both, and then if they both can't access it because it's too far away or it's too high, then it doesn't help them. Neither can access it, right?
Correct. Then it's prohibited to both.
But what if they can both access it?
Then it's prohibited to both also, because
Why can't they both use it then?
whenever you have two groups that did not make an error with each other, who have shared space, that shared space is usher.
Why?
Right. Because they have to make an error to join it. Right? Whenever, that's the same reason.
It's like a penalty. There's like a penalty that they didn't join forces.
Well, it's a penalty, but I think it's more than a penalty. It's shared space that did not have an error made. That's why every chutzner is usher. If you have two houses, don't make an error, but they have shared space in front of them. Right? The shared space is usher because each group is separate, and they're separate, but they have access to that space.
They could have made an Eruv together for that space.
Absolutely, they could have made an Eruv together, but that's the case here, is where they made an Eruv individual.
Right.
So they're separate. I think the point, I thought maybe the point you were going to is it's a little tricky, and Rashi talks about this if you look at the first Rashi, or in the Mishnah actually, that, the question of how you can have two groups in one chutzner, but they make two Eruvin, right? Because otherwise you might think they can't make any Eruv, right? But you can, even within one chutzner, you have a distinct group on the second story and a distinct group on the first story, you can make an Eruv within your own sort of segment. And it counts, but it only counts for space that's only your space. And so, like you said, if there's a space that's jointly accessible or inaccessible to both groups, that would become us.
Is this like the case where they're living in a castle or something, or they each one made like a?
Yeah, it's not that different. Where each group had their own segment. Yeah.
The other odd thing about it is the fact that it says, it makes it almost like a general statement in the most recently quoted Mishnah of saying, that if it's less than 10 tfachim, then it goes to the chutzner, because less than 10 tfachim could be much less than 10 tfachim. And if it's much less than 10 tfachim, if it's enough less than 10 tfachim, it would no longer be accessible to the upper story, and then it would only go to the chutzner, and then the chutzner would be able to carry there.
Right.
It'd be part of the ground if it was below 3 or something, right, or whatever.
That's all different. It makes below 3, right? But that's but I agree. So I think, David, that the point that we're making now, the Mishnah is very inexact, of course, but from the Seifa, you have to understand mechein lechatzer, meaning lechatzer, meaning af lechatzer, and that's how Rav will therefore understand it in the first part of the Mishnah.
Right.
Okay.
And as a result, the af lechatzer means that it remains within a certain distance, under 10 tefachim away from the level of the upper level.
Correct, 100%. Okay, we're gonna stop here, David.
There was one case that Shmuel didn't address. That's where both parties are reaching in the same direction, but it's still harder for one party.
You mean because one is 10 tefachim and one is 20 tefachim?
Yeah, or they're both reaching,
Shmuel doesn't address
down. Yeah.
Right. It's not clear, to be honest with you, whether you say once you're above a certain level, it's hard. Hard is hard, right? Shmuel made a distinction between up and down because it's generally easier to get things down than to get things up. But I agree with you. I don't think that Shmuel makes that distinction between how much hard. I mean, at some point, it's hard to give shiurim for this kind of stuff, but Shmuel does not make that distinction that I'm aware of.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Shavua
See you all
tov.
tomorrow.
David, see you tomorrow. Thank you. And
45 minutes after.
45 minutes starting next week. 45 minutes after Havdalah.
After Havdalah, okay.
All right. You want to just send a confirmatory email to Rav Ezra?
I'll send it out.
Awesome. Thanks.
Shavua tov.
Okay.